Dragon dreams are an incredibly rare gift that very few Targaryens possess. Those who do tend to shape the history of those around them, and we've seen them in a few iterations throughout the history of Ice and Fire. We know that Aegon the Conqueror dreamt his Song of Ice and Fire. We know that Dana the Dreamer caused the Targaryens to flee from Valyria ahead of the Doom. And in House of the Dragon, we know that Helaena Targaryen gets glimpses of the future. These glimpses are often ignored by those around her, including her husband, her mother, her other brother, a number of people. But we see in the House of Dragons season 2 premiere that she seems to be recording these prophecies. Today, we're going to go through the records that exist of some of her prophecies that we haven't seen on screen and examine what they might mean for House of the Dragon and the main series of A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm Quinn the GM, and let's dive into the recorded prophecies of Helaena Targaryen. Helaena seems to be much more of a central character in House of the Dragon Season 2 as compared to Season 1. We get two scenes specifically in her room in the premiere, one of which is her and Aegon and some maids talking. Aegon has a funny line about the Queen being an enduring mystery, which is kind of valid. And then, of course, Blood and Cheese takes place in her chambers later on. But something that takes place in her chambers that I didn't even notice were the prophecies on the walls. After the episode aired, the house that Dragons built was put up on, I think, both Max and the YouTube page of HBO. It revealed a number of details in the sets and costumes that exist for all of these characters in the first episode of season 2. It's a meticulously detailed production, and in this short, we see a number of elements that were not visible to the camera in the season 2 premiere. Most notably, that it seems as though Helaena, has been recording her dreams on her walls. She has been writing down the prophecies and drawing out what she sees in her dreams. And some of these drawings seem to reflect the main series of A Song of Ice and Fire, which strikes me as incredibly interesting, as we've seen very little allusion to that outside of Aegon's dream itself. The first of these is what I've named this video after. I think that in one of these wall paintings that kind of resemble the paintings on Dragonstone we saw in Game of Thrones, we see Daenerys emerging from a fire. It's interesting. I'm not entirely sure that it's her, but it seems more likely than not. It seems like a female form emerging nude from some sort of fire. She's actively on fire, but she doesn't seem to be burning. It's unclear. This is similar to, of course, Daenerys emerging from the pyre with her dragons. There is a green dragon immediately next to this woman, which brings to mind Rhaegal, as one of her dragons is green, especially in the book. However, it is worth noting that in the book, all of Daenerys' hair burns off, and the show, she doesn't have her arms over her head like this. So it's unclear as to whether or not this is Daenerys specifically. However, if I'm thinking about all of Targaryen history, there's another instance of history of a woman burning that people seem to think this might be. But as to not spoil who that is, I'm just going to say that that person is not naked when she burns to death. So overall, I think this seems pretty likely to be depicting Daenerys, maybe in a different pose, maybe more similar to what happened in the books than anything else. And I think it is quite interesting to see that there is maybe some indication of this very important Targaryen from much later on in the A Song of Ice and Fire timeline, even in Helena's consciousness, way back now. There's also notably a single golden and red eye. It's massive. It seems to be bigger than one of the dragon's torso, and it calls to mind a deity of some kind to me. I mean, Eye of Sauron is obviously my first thought, but I don't think he exists in the Song of Ice and Fire. Jury's out. We haven't seen Valyria. My main thought is that this could be some sort of deity worshipped in Valyria that might be lost to time. It is interesting to think about because as far as we've seen dragon dreams of the future mostly, none of the past. So this could be something to happen at some point that hasn't happened yet. But my thought in terms of a deity we might know is that it could be the Lord of Light, the deity R'hllor, worshipped by Melisandre and Thoros of Myr and a number of other characters in the main series. It makes sense that the fiery Valyrians might have a tie to the Lord of Light and this fire god that supposedly protects them all from the darkness, as is the kind of driving force behind Aegon's dream, that being to protect from the darkness. This next one is what I take as probably the most rich of all of the drawings that we've seen so far. Starting up top, we see two decapitated wolves. We see one of their heads actively bleeding and chopped off at this point. It seems as though this page in its entirety is referring to the death of a number of important characters in the main series, most notably the deaths of two kings. The decapitated wolf's head obviously brings to mind Grey Wind and Robb Stark. For those who don't know, after the Red Wedding, Grey Wind was decapitated and his head was tied to Robb's body and paraded around the twins as sort of a victory march for these betrayers. It is interesting that we see two decapitated wolves here, but only one head. It could stand for both Robb and Ned, both of whom lost their heads, but Robb's head being discarded in exchange for a wolf's head later. Hence why that one wolf's head is reading. It is also worth noting that Helena's name is written in one of the wolves, and I'm really not sure what that's about. It could be an interesting reflection. At least as far as I know, Helena doesn't have any interactions with Starks, so really unsure as to what that might be. We also see in this image a boar that seems to be goring something. It's goring the wolf's head, which to me brought to mind the stag that killed the direwolf at the beginning of the A Song of Ice and Fire books and the Game of Thrones show. We can also see in the bottom right corner of this illustration that that same pig has been butchered and cooked fully. That brings to mind Cersei and the death of Robert, as she talks specifically in the books about gaining a taste for boar and really enjoying eating the beast that killed her husband, who she hated so much. So it seems like she might have kind of foreseen Robert Baratheon's death about 170 years early, which is quite interesting and quite significant that she would see it, recognize it as significant, and take to writing it down. I'm not sure if she'd view the Baratheons as a threat after that, but I don't know if she'd be active enough to really figure out the politics of it all, given that she doesn't seem to have a mind for such a thing, as she's more focused on bugs and her dreams. There are two more elements of this drawing to discuss. The first of which is on the far right side. We can see a rat, it looks like. We can see a naked tail, so that is not a mouse. That rat is crowned and holding a knife. There are a number of interpretations to this that could exist. It could be Laris to an extent, as he's been associated with rats, and some believe that he's a green seer, thus making him the king of the rats, potentially able to warg into them. I do think he's probably a warg. I don't think he's a green seer personally. But I do think that the more likely explanation, given the fact that we've never seen Laris with a knife before, is that perhaps this rat represents Cheese, as she does warn Aegon in that scene that I mentioned earlier that she's scared of the rats. Perhaps the crown is saying that he's going to take the crown from the prince that he killed. That very much would make sense, and I think that is a much more likely explanation than her having some dream of Laris, which doesn't seem to pertain to much of her stuff regardless. But then again, I don't think Robert Baratheon pertains to her much, so it could viably be either. The last element of this drawing I'd like to discuss is the baby, which is interesting. Far left corner, you can see that there's a baby who appears to be tied down and or on fire. This could be one of any number of babies on pyres we've seen so far in this series, most notably Balon, the son of Viserys and Aemma, who died, or Visenya, the daughter of Rhaenyra, who died at the middle-ish of last season's finale. That would be interesting and could be a good vision of the future, as Helaena might have seen the death of Visenya before it actually came to pass, which would very much make sense. But it's unclear, as this baby does seem to be fully intact and an actual human baby, whereas we know from behind the scenes stuff that Visenya was kind of scaly and weird and not really fully human. So this is really the thing I have the most question marks about. Who is that baby? The last series of drawings is perhaps the most complicated and difficult to decipher. I'll start with what I can clearly pick out. First off, top middle, we can see pretty clearly a high tower sigil. That is the sigil of her mother's house, her grandfather's house, and obviously very important political players during this era. Next to it, we can see a bird holding a dagger, which I think is fascinating and very clearly brings to mind one thing. That bird holding a dagger, I think, is Littlefinger. The dagger is very important. It's Aegon's dagger. It has the dream in it. That was very obviously inventive of the show, but given this newfound importance that the dagger has, it would make sense that maybe Helena's visions might follow it throughout history. Peter was the one to actually, or sorry, Petire was the one to actually own this dagger and use it to set the entirety of the plot of A Song of Ice and Fire into motion. And I think it's fascinating that she maybe sees all of that from long, long ago, as it would make sense that this conflict is kind of the backdrop to what ends up being the prelude to Aegon's dream. So it is a very important era for Helaena to potentially glimpse. There also appears to be a dead bird next to the bird with the knife, which maybe the other bird stabbed. There might be a blood stain under it, I'm not sure. There are also a bunch of letters and whatnot. It might have been kind of practice for the kids to just learn how to write. But we do see the only decipherable writing that is actually words off to the left. We see something oos kills something fleeing. It's difficult to decipher, My guess would be Noose kills something. My first thought was Baratheon, but I'm not sure. It seems to be writing something down. A noose kills someone, but I'm really unclear on who that someone might be. Other than that, there's just kind of scribbles and letters all over the place that maybe they're coded messages. I need to start getting out ciphers. Maybe I'll do that for next video. I don't think I'm quite that far down the conspiracy iceberg yet, but I'm getting close. Overall, these records of Helena's dreams clearly demonstrate that she is seeing visions of the future. She's seen the boar that kills Robert. She may have seen Littlefinger. She certainly saw blood and cheese. She might have seen Robb's death, as everybody and their mother in A Song of Ice and Fire foretells Robb's death. But I think that overall, she is an incredibly interesting character, and it's going to be fascinating where she goes in the aftermath of her children's death, as she was very clearly disturbed by this tremendously traumatic event that just took place in House of the Dragon. What did you think of these prophetic drawings? Is there anything I missed? Do you have any alternative interpretations? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. While you're down there, leave a like, subscribe, all that typical YouTube stuff. I really appreciate it. It's free and it does help me grow the channel a lot. I'll have a lot of new stuff for House of the Dragon coming out, streams with Fantasy Haven, videos on my own. It's going to be a fun time, and I highly suggest you stick around for the ride. It's going to be great, and I am really looking forward to it because this season is off to a pretty strong start, despite some people's issues with blood and cheese, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. So, yeah, I'll be back with you very soon after next week's episode. Goodbye, everybody.